All right, buckle up, everybody, because today we are diving deep into a Supreme Court case
Yeah.
that's way more relevant to your life than you might think.
It really is.
When you hear the topic, you might think, oh, this doesn't apply to me.
Uh,
But trust me, this one has huge implications for everyone listening.
I think so too, absolutely.
It's all about double jeopardy
Right.
and whether you're protected from it, even here in your home state.
Yeah, that's a big question.
It is a big question,
Yeah.
and it all comes from a case called PALKO v. Connecticut from back in 1937.
It's fascinating how this case, PALKO v. Connecticut, really set the stage for how we understand
Yeah.
some of our most basic rights today.
PALKO might sound like a dusty old legal textbook case,
Yeah.
but trust me, this one's a real nail-biter.
It is.
We're talking about a guy facing the death penalty
Yeah.
because the state wanted a second chance to get a conviction.
Yeah, and that raises a huge question.
It does.
Does the Constitution's protection against double jeopardy apply everywhere in the U.S., or can states just decide to play by their own rules?
Yeah. So before we get too deep into the weeds here, let's make sure we're all on the same page.
Right.
Can you give us a plain English explanation of double jeopardy? I feel like most people have a vague idea, but
I think a lot of people kind of think of it as like a get-out-of-jail-free card, but it's really only for the exact same crime.
okay.
So, for example, let's say you're accused of robbing a bank
Okay.
and you're found not guilty.
Mm-hmm.
Double jeopardy means the government can't come back and try to prosecute you for that same bank robbery again,
Right.
even if they find new evidence.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like a safety net to protect you from
Yeah.
being harassed by the government over and over for the same offense?
That's exactly the idea.
Okay.
The Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution clearly states that no person shall be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb.
Right. But, as you mentioned, things get a little tricky when we start talking about state versus federal law.
Yeah, that's right.
Because the Fifth Amendment specifically protects you from the federal government.
Right.
So how did a case in Connecticut end up being a landmark Supreme Court case about double jeopardy?
Well, in PALKO v. Connecticut, Frank PALKO was initially charged with murder and convicted of second-degree murder, which meant life in prison.
Okay.
But the state of Connecticut wasn't happy with that outcome.
Oh,
They
right.
appealed.
So they appealed the decision.
Yeah, and they got a retrial
What?
where they actually upped the charge to first-degree murder.
Wow. So they basically went for round two, hoping for a harsher sentence?
Yeah, they did.
Didn't that strike Pelko's lawyers as, well, completely unfair?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
PALKO's argument was that Connecticut was blatantly violating his Fifth Amendment right against double jeopardy by retrying him for essentially the same crime.
Right.
And this is where the 14th Amendment comes into play,
Yeah,
and
what-
things get really interesting.
Yeah, you've really got my attention. The 14th Amendment, just a quick reminder for our listeners, was adopted after the Civil War, and it was a game changer.
Huge.
It was designed to ensure equal protection and due process for all citizens, regardless of race.
Right.
But what does it have to do with double jeopardy in Connecticut in 1937?
The 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause states that no state can deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law.
There.
Think of it as a safety net that ensures the government can't just take away your life, your freedom, or your stuff without following fair procedures.
Okay.
Over time, this clause has been used to apply some, but not all, of the Bill of Rights protections to the states.
Wait, hold on a second.
Yeah.
You're saying that not every single right in the Bill of Rights automatically applies to state governments.
That's exactly right.
That seems pretty important for people to understand.
It's a crucial distinction.
Okay.
And this is where the concept of selective incorporation comes in, which is at the heart of the PALKO case.
Okay.
Imagine the Bill of Rights is like a buffet of rights.
Okay, but the states don't have to take everything.
Right.
They can pick and choose which ones they want to serve to their citizens.
So not every state has to serve all the dishes.
Exactly.
Okay. I'm starting to see where this is going.
Good.
So it's like the Supreme Court steps in and says,
Right.
hold on, some of these rights are so essential, you have to offer them on your buffet.
Right, exactly.
But back in 1937, the court hadn't yet decided if protection against double jeopardy was one of those essential rights that applied to the states.
That's right.
So basically, PALKO's life was hanging in the balance
You got it.
while the Supreme Court debated whether this get-out-of-jail-free card even applied to him in Connecticut.
Yeah.
Talk about pressure.
That's a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And this is where Justice Cardozo, who wrote the majority opinion in PALKO, comes in.
Okay.
He had to decide if being protected from being tried twice for the same crime was fundamental enough to apply to states through the 14th Amendment.
Okay, so let's talk about Cardozo's reasoning.
What was his logic for potentially excluding double jeopardy from this essential rights list? It seems like a pretty basic concept of fairness, right?
Yeah, I mean, Cardozo agreed that double jeopardy protection is important,
Right.
but he argued it wasn't so essential to a fair trial that it had to be applied to the states.
Okay.
He believed some rights are absolutely indispensable to a system of ordered liberty.
What kinds of rights did he consider to be absolutely essential?
Things like freedom of speech or the right to an attorney.
Okay.
In Cardozo's view, you simply can't have a truly fair system without those.
Okay.
Other rights, while valuable, might not be quite as critical to the core of our justice system.
So Cardozo was drawing a distinction between truly essential fundamental rights and those that might be important but not quite like deal breakers when it comes to a fair system.
Yeah.
I can see how that line of thinking might make sense, but it also seems kind of risky, right?
Yeah, it definitely raises some questions.
Right.
And even some legal scholars at the time disagreed with Cardozo's view on this.
Well, I guess that's why they call it a debate.
That's right.
Were there any specific examples from the PALKO case itself that illustrate this difference between essential and important but not essential rights?
Yeah, so Cardozo specifically pointed to the right to a trial by jury
Okay.
as an example of a right that could be modified without totally undermining the fairness of the system.
Yeah.
He said that states could experiment with different ways of conducting trials, even doing away with juries in some cases without violating the 14th Amendment.
But that seems pretty drastic.
It does.
What about a right like freedom of speech? Where did that fall on Cardozo's spectrum of rights?
Cardozo considered freedom of speech to be absolutely essential.
Right.
He thought it was a cornerstone of liberty,
Right.
and any attempt to restrict it would be a major red flag.
So to sum up Cardozo's argument, he basically said, look, double jeopardy protection is a good idea, but it's not a deal breaker for a fair trial.
Yeah.
States should have some leeway to handle these matters differently. And the majority of the court agreed with him.
They did.
So unfortunately for Frank PALKO, his double jeopardy claim was rejected,
Right.
and he was ultimately executed in 1938.
Yeah,
Wow, what a tragic outcome.
it is.
It really underscores how high the stakes were in this case
Yeah.
and how much hinged on the Supreme Court's interpretation of these fundamental rights.
Absolutely.
But before we move on, I want to make sure I'm following you here.
Okay.
You said earlier that the 14th Amendment has been used to apply some of the Bill of Rights to the states, but not all of them.
Right.
And then we have Cardozo saying some rights are more important than others.
Yeah.
Isn't that a recipe for a real patchwork of rights across the country?
Yeah, that's a good question.
How can we have a truly unified system of justice if states can pick and choose which fundamental rights to uphold?
Well, that's a really insightful question.
Yeah.
And you're hitting on one of the biggest debates in constitutional law. If you think about it, selective incorporation creates this ongoing tension between state autonomy and individual rights.
So on one hand, we want states to have some flexibility to govern themselves.
Right.
But on the other hand, we don't want people's basic rights to depend on their zip code.
Exactly.
And as you might imagine, this debate has continued to play out over decades, with different Supreme Court justices weighing in on which rights should be considered fundamental enough to apply to the states.
That's right.
The PALKO case was just the beginning.
It was.
I'm starting to realize that this whole issue of selective incorporation is much more complex and nuanced than I initially thought.
Yeah.
It's not just about memorizing which rights apply where. It's about understanding the philosophical underpinnings of our legal system
Right.
and how those principles are constantly being tested and refined.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've established that in 1937, the Supreme Court decided that double jeopardy protection wasn't fundamental enough to apply to the states.
Right.
And that had a very real and tragic impact on Frank PALKO.
It did.
But didn't you say earlier that this part of the PALKO decision was later overturned?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
And this is a perfect example of how our understanding of rights can change over time.
Right.
In 1969, a case called Benton v. Maryland came before the Supreme Court.
Mm-hmm.
And this time, the court reversed course
Wow.
and firmly established that the Fifth Amendment's protection against double jeopardy is, in fact, a fundamental right that applies to the states through the 14th Amendment.
So wait, does that mean that if PALKO's case had happened after 1969, he might not have been executed?
That's a very real possibility.
Wow.
The court in Benton looked back at PALKO and explicitly stated that its earlier decision had been wrong.
Okay.
They acknowledged that double jeopardy protection is a cornerstone of a fair legal system,
Right.
and that it should apply equally to everyone, regardless of which state they live in.
That's a pretty dramatic reversal.
It is.
It makes you wonder what other rights might be considered fundamental in the future, right?
Yeah.
Maybe things that we don't even think about today could become essential rights down the road.
Yeah, that's true.
It's almost like a constant evolution of our understanding of what constitutes a just society.
You've hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
The beauty of studying constitutional law is that it's not just a set of rules written in stone.
Right.
It's a dynamic process of interpretation and reinterpretation that reflects the changing values and priorities of our society.
So we've gone pretty deep on this case.
We have.
But what's the takeaway for our listeners?
Yeah.
Why should anyone care about PALKO v. Connecticut today, especially since it was ultimately overturned?
Well, even though the specific ruling on double jeopardy was reversed, PALKO is still hugely important.
Right.
It really solidified the concept of selective incorporation,
Right.
which, as we've discussed, is this ongoing process of deciding which parts of the Bill of Rights apply to the states.
So PALKO is like this key building block in shaping how our rights are actually protected on a day-to-day basis.
That's right.
It's not just about what's written in the Constitution. It's about how those words are interpreted and applied in real life.
Exactly. And it highlights something really crucial about our legal system.
Okay.
It's not static.
Right.
It's constantly evolving. PALKO shows us that our understanding of fundamental rights can change over time as society's values and priorities shift.
It's kind of like we're all part of this ongoing conversation about what constitutes a fair and just society.
Right.
And the Supreme Court is like the moderator,
Yeah.
weighing in on the big questions.
That's a great analogy.
Oh, thing.
And PALKO started a conversation that's still going on today.
Yeah.
Think about all of the debates we have now about privacy in the digital age, about the balance between free speech and online harassment, about the limits of government surveillance.
Yeah, it's crazy to think about how much things have changed.
Yeah.
And how quickly.
Right.
These are all, in a way, extensions of the questions raised in PALKO.
I think so.
It really makes you wonder what other rights might be considered fundamental in the future. I mean, who could have predicted 50 years ago that we'd be arguing about things like the right to access the internet or the right to delete embarrassing social media posts?
It's impossible to say for sure what the future holds, but that's what makes studying constitutional law so fascinating.
Yeah.
It's not just about looking back at historical cases.
Yeah.
It's about using those cases as a lens to understand the ongoing evolution of our rights and freedoms.
So what's the big aha moment that you hope listeners walk away with from this deep dive?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
What's the one thing you really want to stick with them?
I think the most important takeaway is that your rights aren't set in stone.
Okay.
They're constantly being debated, challenged, and redefined.
So we can't just assume that because we have a right today,
Right.
we're always going to have that, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's a good thing.
Yeah.
It means that our legal system is capable of adapting to new challenges and reflecting the changing needs and values of our society.
That's a really empowering message.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
so. It means we all have a role to play in shaping the future of our rights.
Right.
It's not just up to the courts. It's up to all of us to be engaged citizens and participate in these important conversations.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive on PALKO v. Connecticut.
My pleasure.
It was a pleasure having you.
Thank you.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us, listeners. We hope you surfaced with a new appreciation for the complexity and importance of our legal system.
Yeah, I hope so.
And remember, the conversation about our rights never ends.
It doesn't.
What will you add to it?